There we go.
Thank you, Catherine. And apologies, everybody. I'll start again. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on becoming a net zero carbon church. This webinar is designed to help you get your church started on becoming net zero, the start of your net zero journey. And so it's going to run through what net zero carbon means, what kind of practical changes you might require, how do you know your starting point, what resources have we got, some inspiring examples from around the country to help you see what can be done. We've got a number of other webinars coming up over the next couple of months. So there's a similar session for theological colleges next on the 16th of March, and that will follow a sort of format. We've already done a couple of other sessions on the diocese, so those are all on recordings on the website. Then we've got a session on preaching for God's world. It's the opportunity to include the environment in your preaching. And there's going to be an international panel of speakers talking about why we need to preach on creation care and to give you some ideas on how to do it. So that's on April the 20th. And then going back to the more bricks and mortar side of things, we've got two sessions for church solar panels. So there'll be the same information provided, but they'll be live. That's on the 19th of April and 20th of June. It's giving you an introduction to solar PV panel technology, how it can be used, what its applications are, and what the benefits are. So this is an update of a webinar that was run a couple of years ago, but it's all new content, updated. And then there are two sessions each of two on church heat. So you should replace or not, and choosing the right heating solutions. So these are really important for you if you're looking at your heating in your church. And then we've also got a day of heat pump training if you need to know more about the real details of heat pumps. It's going to cover practicalities of installing it and understanding the pros and cons of the different heat pumps. And then also in June, another sort of totally different kind of sequence of webinars. We've got a week of lunchtime webinars on church's count on nature. So there's a variety of topics, and if you look on the website, you'll be able to find those. But it includes things like churchyard management, and Bishop Graham is going to be giving a webinar, and there are also a webinar on the twin crises of climate and nature. So as usual, please type your questions into the Q&A, not into the chat. And if you see a question that someone else has already put on there that you'd like the answer to, if you give it the thumbs up, that will raise it up our list, and we'll start with the ones with the most upvotes when we start going through the questions. We will send you the slides and any links from the chat after the webinar. And this webinar is being recorded, and it will be shared through our website and YouTube. It'll probably be about a week before it gets up on there. So moving on to the most important part, I'm going to introduce you. I'm going to introduce myself first. I'm Denise Rowley, Net Zero Carbon Programme Officer with the National Church. And today our speaker is Catherine Ross. She is the Net Zero Carbon Senior Project Manager for the National Church, and she's going to introduce herself and then go through the webinar. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow you to hear from Catherine.
Thanks, Denise. Yeah, so I have worked for the church now for a little bit less than 4 years. My role initially was looking at all aspects of environmental sustainability for churches and cathedrals as part of the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division nationally. And then when Synod passed their motion calling on all parts of the church to work towards net zero carbon by 2030, increasingly my work has focused more and more on the net zero carbon side of things. And recently I've changed role and changed role title to be focusing just on net zero carbon, but with a particular interest still in churches and cathedrals. Before I did this role, my job was to work with the 24 churches in Islington on the Islington Sustainable Church Buildings project. I was based with a grant funder that gives grants towards the maintenance of churches in that particular borough. And I worked hands-on with those 24 churches, doing energy audits of the churches, and then working with them. They were applying into me for grants for projects, and we implemented solar panels on 8 of the churches, new heating systems, but also really simple things of lagging heating pipes and fixing broken windows. So I've got the national perspective from the role I do now, but I have also been involved really locally and hands-on with some churches and seen how hard it is to do projects and how limited the time is that people have locally. I'm conscious in running this session today that there'll be people joining with really, really different start points. There'll be some of you joining thinking, this is all impossible. It's another thing. How are we going to find the time? Where would we even start? And there'll be others who are joining from churches that have really grabbed this agenda, and maybe you've started scoping up a project for a new heat pump or something. You'll be in really different places. I hope that there's something for everybody. It is kind of starting at the beginning. So those of you that are kind of further into this, you might want to find some of our other webinars. We've got a whole load of recordings on our website about different kinds of heating, about solar panels, about EV car charging, about all sorts of things. Today is that kind of where do we begin session. Right, let me start by sharing my screen and remembering to share sound because we've got a couple of videos. Right. So this church here, I always like to start with this church here. This is St. Michael and All Angels, Withington. As you can see, beautiful, grade 1 listed Norman rural church. It's a lovely church. It also has a really good claim to being Britain's first zero carbon church of the modern era. So since we've had heating and lighting. How did they get there? They started with simple things to reduce their energy use. So they consulted their community about reducing the hours that the flood lighting runs for. They switched all the lighting inside to energy efficient lighting. They've installed solar panels on the roof here behind the parapet. And originally they tried biomass heating. Biomass didn't work out well for them, and then they've switched to electric pew heating. When the sun is shining, the electricity for those pews is coming from the solar panels. When it's not, they're drawing the electricity from the grid and they're on a green tariff. And the extra electricity that the panels generate at times when the church isn't using it, that extra electricity goes out to the grid, and that acts as a valid offset against the remaining carbon footprint of this church. So they are a net zero carbon church. And the reason I like to start with them is that they look like any other beautiful church. People immediately think that there has to be a conflict, a tension between net zero carbon and the heritage of our buildings, but it doesn't have to be that way when we come up with the right solution for that building. The next sort of about 40 minutes, I'm going to be talking about church buildings. Also a reminder that much of it applies to church halls. And in many cases, it can be easier to take action on church halls. And they often have a higher carbon footprint, and they're quite often of a lower listing and more modern construction. So they can be easier to take action on more quickly than the church. This is very much a practical bricks and mortar session. We're talking about the buildings. I'm very conscious that hearts and minds is a really big issue as well. If you're looking for sessions on how to engage hearts and minds, we've got webinars recorded on our website on how to form your team. And also we've got 3 different webinars about Eco Church, which is a really good place to start. Whilst having said it's going to be all bricks and mortar, I do just want to start with one slide reminding everybody that this work is really firmly rooted in the mission of the church. The 5 marks of mission, the fifth mark to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. Every time we're turning on our heating, every time we're switching on our lights, we're using a tiny bit, but we are using it, a fossil fuel. And we're therefore contributing to man-made climate change, and everything comes with that. So by reducing the carbon emissions of our buildings, we are helping to safeguard the integrity of creation. And of course, environmental issues weave right through all 5 marks of mission, particularly number 4 around justice. The injustice of climate change and the impacts that it's having on the poorest people in the poorest country of the world just cannot be underestimated. Right, let's start with the definition. What do we even mean when we talk about being zero carbon or net zero carbon? For any building, you can take the energy use of that building, so the oil, the gas, the electricity. You can multiply it by absolutely standard conversion factors, which are updated by the government every year. So you get your bills, you get the kilowatt hours or the litres of oil, you multiply them by those conversion factors. That gives you an amount of carbon dioxide equivalent, your greenhouse gas emissions. And you can do the same with the fuel that's used in transport. You can get the mileage that's been done in cars, petrol and diesel cars, and multiply that by absolutely standard conversion factors. When you add those together, those give you the majority of a church's gross carbon footprint. It doesn't take account of everything. It's not taking account of food or water, for example, but it gives you the majority of a church's gross carbon footprint. To get to the net carbon footprint, you can take off 2 things. The first is 100% renewable electricity, either coming from your own solar panels or if it's being bought on a green tariff. And then you can also look at any carbon offsets or sequestration. So offsets are where it's like a form of trade. You're paying some money here for someone else somewhere in the world to reduce their carbon. Or sequestration is where you're actually physically removing that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. There are complicated technical ways of doing that, but then there's also old-fashioned trees and shrubs and soils. Once you've taken those off, that gives you the majority of a church's net carbon footprint. And that's what we're being challenged, tasked by General Synod to achieve, is net zero carbon by 2030. So that means reducing where we can the energy use, reducing where we can fuel-based transport. It means increasing where we can the cleanness of the sources of our remaining energy, and where we can't do any of those, offsetting or sequestering the rest. And before I go into everything else I'm going to tell you, I just wanted to begin by this message. It's really what I'm hoping that you'll leave today, is it might not be easy, but it's not impossible either. Yes, we know there are barriers. We know there are barriers around the passion and commitment and leadership in some places. We know there are barriers around people having enough time, having enough money, having really good quality local advice and getting the permission. And projects can only happen when all 5 of these line up at the same time. But we also know that already 7% of churches who complete the energy footprint tool, we can see from their results that they're already net zero carbon. The majority of these 7% of churches are ones which have fully electric heating and are on a green electricity tariff. We know there are quick wins, and I'll be talking about that as I go through. We know that a lot of getting to net zero carbon for many of our churches, especially the smaller ones, the ones which are used less often, is about good maintenance, and we're already trying to do that. We know from the energy footprint tool that our smaller and less used churches already have a really low carbon footprint, and again I'll touch on that as I go along. And we know that when it's done right, actions that achieve net zero carbon can also cut running costs and increase the comfort of the congregation. So I wanted to begin with a real example to give you a sense of the fact that this is possible, this kind of change is possible. So I'm going to show you one of our case study videos, and this is of St. Michael's, Baddesley, Clinton. And Denise, once I press play, if you can just confirm that it's all working fine and the sound is working fine, that would be really helpful.
I will do. Yes.
winter of 2017-18 was incredibly cold. The congregation were cold and complaining they were cold. We were at the peak of our electricity usage, to the point where we had almost a fire in the vestry. We had smoke coming out of the cupboards. We had to evacuate the church. And it was really at that point we said, something's got to change. We decided we would heat the people and not the building. I'd read an article somewhere about under-pew heating. So I actually contacted a consultant to come and gave us an overview of what we should be doing, which was in fact under-pew heating, plus a heater up by the altar for our poor old rector, who doesn't sit in a pew, and he was the only one who would be cold, so we've got him a heater as well. So what it taught us was that instead of putting one pew heater in the centre, it was much better to buy two smaller pew heaters and put two heaters per pew, so it covered the whole width of the pews.
Since this under-pew heating has been installed, and it really is beneficial to the older congregation.
The lovely thing is now I can put my hands near the heaters and I can actually turn the pages in the hymn book and the prayer book in a much more relaxed way, instead of being taut and shivering.
We had a quotation from the consultant, which was incredibly expensive, and we felt that it was not a difficult task to do it ourselves. So we ended up going around various electrical wholesalers, finding out the cost of pew heaters, contacting independent electricians to find out how much it would cost to put them in, and in fact it saved 60% of the cost that the original person came and gave us as a price. All we did was I bought the pew heaters, as we contacted the electrician. We had a date, he came in, he put them all in, and we now have, I believe, a very happy congregation who are nice and warm. We were very keen to reduce the electrical consumption in the church further if we could. So we also changed all the light bulbs in the church to LEDs. So we actually saved approximately 2 kilowatts of electricity just by changing the light bulbs to LEDs. The old heaters we had to have on for 3.5 hours before a service, plus the hour service, so they were on for 4.5 hours using electricity. The new under-pew heaters only have to be on for half an hour before the service, so it's a third of what we used to use. We have 2 time clocks with a rocker switch that we can alternate the time clocks. So one time clock works the heating for communion in the morning, the other time clock works for evensong in the afternoon. We also have a smart meter, so our treasurer can work out virtually every half an hour how much electrical consumption we use, so he's able to tell when in the week we are using and not using electricity. We decided after we'd done all this that we really wanted to go to a renewables electrical provider. So our treasurer contacted various companies, so we changed companies and all our electricity now is renewable. I think my advice to you, if you are looking to do this type of project, first of all, is don't be afraid of it. It's not that difficult. We've done it, and we're a small church with a small community, and we manage it fairly easily. There are people out there that can help you. If there's no one else that can help you, I'll be happy to help you.
Now I imagine that, that wasn't meant to happen. Not meant to play again. I'm sure that some of you will be watching that going, yes, but that doesn't work for us because of. The right answer for any given church is really, really case by case. It depends on so many different factors, and you know your church. That video is just there to give you an example of the fact that this kind of change is possible. But obviously what you will need for your church is really good local advice to decide what's the right thing to do. So here's our church. We want to make it a zero carbon church. Where are we trying to get to? We're trying to get to having lower bills. We're trying to protect ourselves against the potential of lower carbon taxes in the future. We want it to be a comfortable and welcoming place to be. We want it to be a cool sanctuary during hot summers. And we want it to get down to net zero carbon so that we're not contributing ourselves to climate change. We start with some advantages. We don't often think about these advantages, but we do start with some real advantages. We start with local materials. Our churches are made of local materials. We've got low embodied carbon. We've got a high thermal mass in many of our churches, which means that they retain heat. We've got high solar gain through those big windows. We've got grounds for planting. And also fundamentally, if you think about sustainability and what that word means, we can claim to have some of the most sustainable buildings in England. They still fulfill the purpose for which they were built after centuries. And how have they done that? They've done that by adapting over time. Our net zero carbon church, first we're going to establish 6 principles. The first of those is well maintained. It's not it's not a radical principle, but having a well-maintained church is so important. Otherwise, the heat that you're generating from your heating system will be disappearing out through those broken windows, through those holes in the roof. Buying renewable so that our electricity, and it's harder, but where possible, our gas is from green sources. Wasting less of what we use. So that's particularly around having good heating controls, having good lighting controls, and tackling waste of other kinds as well. Where we can, and over time, moving away from gas and oil heating based on fossil fuels to electric heating, with that electricity coming from the clean sources. It's not possible everywhere, but where it is possible, generating more of our own electricity through solar panels in particular. And then for that residue, for the bit that's left at the end, offsetting the rest. Now I'm going to show you a menu of the kind of things that churches will be considering when they're thinking about how to move towards net zero carbon church. They're a menu. I would never expect to see everything in one place. It's really, really case by case. I'm going to show you a whole range of ideas, and for some of them you'll immediately be able to go, that wouldn't work for us, but others, maybe that's something you could explore. And I'm going to mention it maybe 3 or 4 times as we go along. One really good place to start is to get yourself an energy audit, where somebody comes to your site and they recommends for you and in your circumstances what the actions are that you would be best to take. So what kind of things is our net zero carbon church looking at doing? First of those, well-maintained roof, well-maintained gutters, the basics. Floodlights, moving over to LED, and also considering whether you can reduce the hours that you run your floodlighting for. Energy efficient LED path lights. Maybe a water butt, so you're catching some of that water from your roof to use in the garden. Dealing in whatever way is necessary for your windows with reducing heat loss and draft proofing of doors and windows. Maybe you'll have bike racks. Maybe you'll have EV car charging to encourage people to come to church by sustainable routes. Maybe you'll have something like a heat pump or another form of low carbon heating. In some cases, you might have a building that's suitable for insulating renders or external insulation. That's more likely if you're a modern church or if you've got a modern church hall. And perhaps you'll have solar panels on the roof. Again, not possible everywhere, but it is possible in many cases. What might the inside of our net zero carbon church look like? Well, again, LED lighting. If you have an easy to access void already in your roof, then that's a good thing to think about loft insulation. Or if you're re-roofing anyway, that's a good moment. Low carbon heating, lots of different approaches to heating, but some form of low carbon heating, perhaps pew heaters, panel heaters, heater cushions. Having soft furnishings that enable people to keep their body heat, so rugs and cushions. An internal draft curtain or an internal draft lobby that stops the warm air going out through the door as people come and go. You might be considering partitioning, so you've got a smaller space that you can keep warm. If you've got solar panels on the roof, you might be thinking about battery storage so that you can capture some of that electricity to use when the sun's not shining. Really important one is having your heating and lighting well zoned and well timed so that it fits with the usage of the church. some churches are considering moving back the way things used to be, where service times vary with the seasons, so that in the winter you can make the most of that solar gain through the big windows and have your service later in the day. In the kitchen, thinking about energy efficiency and energy efficient appliances, and in the bathrooms, thinking about low flush toilets. A little bit of context, that of the Church of England's total carbon footprint, only a third actually comes from churches and from church halls. Churches are this dark purple slice here, and green and yellow is the church halls. The biggest slices actually are schools, and then after churches and church halls, it's then housing. For that church slice, we know that heating makes up the vast majority of a church's energy use. So that's where we have to focus our action. This graph is from a sample of our church energy audits, where we were able to distinguish how the energy was being used in the building, and 84% was for heating. It makes it really clear that that has to be the primary focus of our efforts. And then we know from the energy footprint tool what we would intuitively know anyway, that our larger, busier churches, where the heating is on for much of the week, are the ones which have the higher emissions. They're also often the ones who are really actively fulfilling their mission all week round with activities for their community. And we don't want those to stop under any circumstances. But it does just reflect through that the more hours in the week the heating is running, the larger the space you're trying to keep warm, the higher your carbon footprint. And this graph from the results of the energy footprint tool show us that difference between the average small rural church only has a carbon footprint of 1.5 tonnes. That's tiny. As a UK citizen, my carbon footprint alone is probably about 10 tonnes a year. Whereas our larger, and particularly these larger urban churches, have that much higher carbon footprint. And that points to really different solutions, really different actions that are needed, depending on the carbon footprint. Over here on the left, it's really about good maintenance. On the right, that's where you would start thinking about bigger interventions in the building. And that's what has led us to develop the practical path to net zero carbon. I'm really hoping you've already come across this document, and Denise will be putting a link in the chat through to it. The practical path to net zero carbon is 2 sides of A4 that summarizes where do we start, what do we do next, how do we get to zero, and some only if actions. We've also got a self-guided version of the practical path to net zero that you can find on our website and that you can use in your church. So you can kind of use it as a checklist and walk around, tick things off and work out what's relevant for you. So the things in where do we start? These are designed to be pretty much no regret actions that any church would want to consider. What next? Are slightly bigger projects, and they're more likely to be relevant for slightly busier, larger churches. Getting to zero are the much bigger projects. They're generally only relevant for the high energy using very busy churches. And then the only if things are things you would do in particular circumstances. Let's start with the where do we start? So in here, what are we talking about in part A of the practical path to net zero carbon? Maintaining our roofs, our gutters, our broken windows, insulate around pipes, deal with drafts, soft furnishings which are relatively easy to install, rugs, floor coverings and cushions, 100% renewable electricity. I know it's hard to switch at the moment. Energy markets will have to settle back down at some point. Making sure that your heating timings are matched to your use. Getting timers and smart controllers where you don't already have them. Making sure you're looking after your existing heating system with antifreeze and anti-sludge filters. Where you can, doing easy LED light bulb replacements. And behavior changes like turning things off. So these are the simple steps, things that don't cost the earth. I love these thermal imaging camera photographs because they really bring it to life. This is the bottom of a church door. The warmer colours are where it's warmer, the colder colours are where it's colder. And you can see the cold air coming through under this door. This is a thermal imaging camera photograph of a pew just after these 5 people have stood up and walked away. And you can see that they've left their body heat behind on the pew. They arrived in church warm and comfortable. They sat down, and by the end, they were feeling cold because their body heat's gone out into the pew and through their feet into the floor. That's why having runners on the floor and pew cushions can really help people conserve that body heat. This is a photograph of a radiator that hasn't been cleared out, and you can see it can't work effectively. This is a photograph of the underfloor heating running quite hard work over here, but the chairs have been moved to one side so the people can't benefit from it. And finally, this one is really just for amusement. This is a toilet that's been plumbed in so it's flushing with the hot water rather than flushing with the cold, and it's glowing brightly. These are simple steps that don't cost the earth. So what are those quick wins? We know from the church energy audits that these are the kind of things that don't cost very much money, and they make a difference to your energy use, matching your heating timing to use, turning off your heating before the end of the service, completing the energy footprint tool each year and communicating those results, creating an energy champion, so someone in your church who checks the bills and reminds people to turn things off, encouraging people to turn things off, moving your ECC meetings to other venues during cold months, getting a smart meter installed by your energy supplier. Potentially, I know this only works in some places, varying your service times in winter, maintenance, the roof, the gutters, the window panes, insulate around your heating pipes, draft proof around your gaps, and as lights fail, replacing them with LED bulbs where suitable. Hopefully some of those quick wins are things which are relevant for you in your church. The very rough cost of part A of the practical path to net zero carbon. I'm always really nervous of quoting any kinds of costs because there is no typical church. These are averages across a large number of churches. Looking at a small church that's used maybe once a week, a medium-sized church used 1 to 2 times a week, a large church that's used more often, and a really large church used really often. If you do everything in part A of the practical path to net zero, on average, these are the sorts of costs you'd expect to pay. But only some of that is additional on what you would be doing for good maintenance anyway. We know from the church energy audits that doing everything in part A of the practical path to net zero achieves about, it varies from church to church, but about a 50% reduction in energy. And whilst payback periods vary, they work out to be about, on average, 5 years. For smaller, less used churches, these basic steps are where to focus your efforts. Unless, it's an important caveat, you think your heating is going to fail soon, in which case you also need to be thinking about your heating. But if your heating is running all right at the moment and you're only using it a couple of hours a week, your carbon footprint is really low. So think about those quick wins, think about doing those basics. Then the what next. So now we're starting to move into larger projects, which would typically only happen for busier, higher emission churches. And pretty much everything here, you're going to be looking for some specialist advice. You're going to be looking to involve your DAC. So here it's about, if you have an easy to access loft, considering insulation, considering partitioning so you get smaller areas which are easier to heat, considering a draft lobby, using data loggers to understand how your building responds and using that to set your heating timings more accurately, improving the zoning in your building so that different zones come on and are separately controlled, potentially through using thermostatic radiator valves, making sure your boiler temperatures are set correctly. You might want to install thermal or motion sensors so that your lights only come on when they're needed. And over time, thinking through how you're going to replace gas and oil space heating with electric solutions of one kind or another. For these sort of medium churches, that's most likely to be pew or panel heaters or maybe chandeliers. For larger, even more heavily used churches, you might be thinking about heat pumps. Why is this so important? I showed you before that graph that 84% of church energy use is on its heating. We also know, these pictures show us what we already know, which is that hot air rises. The hot air in these churches is rising up to the roof. And so for people down here to benefit, we need to run the heating long enough and remember that that hot air is coming by burning a fossil fuel in our boilers. Burning a fossil fuel, we're creating hot water, we're using that to create hot air. The hot air rises, it has to come all the way back down to people before it's giving them any benefit. We need to really challenge that start point of space heating. Unless it's needed to stabilize historic interiors, instead, we need to start thinking about how do we make people comfortable. That needs to be our start point. How do we make the people using our building comfortable whilst conserving our interiors? And that means solutions like pew heaters that you saw in the video, solutions like infrared radiant panel heaters, these brown panels here on the ceiling and the white panels over here on the left, solutions like chandelier heaters, and for some heat pumps, that can be air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps. There are a whole variety of different kinds. And it gives us a double benefit if we think about our heating and change our approach in this way. By moving from space heating to people heating, and therefore only using the amount of energy we need to keep people comfortable, that cuts our gross carbon footprint. But also by moving to electric heating and having that electricity coming from clean sources, we're also cutting our net carbon footprint. What are the costs of doing these things? Costs vary enormously, and so I get even more nervous about averages at this point. But here are some examples of typical costs that would come from our church energy auditors for churches where they're saying this is an appropriate thing to do. So not necessarily for every church, but for a church where they think this is the right solution, these are the sort of average costs you'd be seeing. So thermal and motion sensors, not very expensive. Improving heating zones and controls, not that expensive for the benefit that it brings. Insulating the loft if you have an easy to access void, so you're really just thinking about the materials and the labor, maybe 4 up to 10,000. Creating a draft lobby, a little bit more, quite a bit more expensive than that. And under pew heating, again, a bit more expensive than that. But remembering that, as we saw in that video, it brings real savings on the operating costs of the system. As I touched on earlier, commissioning an energy audit is a really good first step. Some of your dioceses already offer them, and then there's the national scheme through parish buying, where you can purchase an energy audit. And as I said earlier, with these larger projects, the church should be always seeking appropriate professional advice and consulting your DAC. Then we start to get into those really big projects, getting to zero. Everything here is going to require advice, it's going to require faculty permission, it's going to require the involvement of your DAC. Here we're into things like serious projects around draft proofing windows, secondary and double glazing in suitable places such as offices, halls and vestries. If you've got a tower ceiling, looking at draft proofing it. If you've got blue pew platforms, looking at insulating underneath. If you have suitable areas, here we might be thinking about a church hall, internal insulation. Some churches are starting to consider reinstating ceilings that have been removed earlier in their history, putting those ceilings back in and insulating above. Whole new lighting systems where simple LED replacements don't work or aren't possible, and potentially solar panels. In the right place, solar panels and other renewables really can be part of the solution. I love this picture from Gloucester Cathedral. This map, every little one of the sunshine symbols is a solar panel installation somewhere on a church. This is already being achieved in many locations. But there is still a perception and in some cases a reality that it will be difficult to get permission. This photograph is King's College Chapel in Cambridge, and you may well have seen in the news that they have just recently been awarded planning permission to put solar panels on the roof, and we are awaiting the decision on faculty. We know that the rules on visibility do need to be tested. Recently, the Church Builders Council has updated our solar panel guidance, and whilst it is still absolutely case by case, it is more permissive than the guidance that went before. And Historic England and the other amenity societies are also having to consider their position on these issues. We do know as a church, we are conscious of the fact that the missional impact of solar panels can only be maximised if they are visible, and that a strong case can be made about the public benefit of panels having to be given increased weight when being balanced against the harm to heritage. So whilst it is still case by case, I would encourage you to think through whether it is possible in your area. Again, costs vary so enormously. I'm so nervous of putting them up because I know that there'll be people there thinking, but we got a quote and it wasn't that for us. But these are some sensible sort of averages. These are only for the materials and the labour. They don't include professional fees and they don't include scaffolding. So looking at double glazing or secondary glazing, suitable windows in well-used areas. So we're thinking about offices and vestries and halls, maybe 10, maybe £15,000. A whole new lighting system, maybe 30, maybe 60. Solar PV somewhere between about 15 and 60, although as I said, that doesn't include scaffolding and that varies enormously. Again, commissioning an energy audit is a really good first step. Now those only ifs. So these are things you would think about in particular circumstances. For example, if you're re-roofing anyway, think about insulation, think about solar panels, work out whether that's something you should do at the same time. If you've got a cavity, and some of our more modern churches do, and some of our church halls do, then if you don't already, looking at cavity wall insulation. If you've got a suitable building and a really well-used building that's heated very regularly, you might want to think about external renders or insulation. If you've got a church that's used all week round, and therefore a low-level heat being run every day would work well in your circumstance, that's when heat pumps tend to be useful. They don't tend to work well if you've got an erratically used church that's maybe only used once or twice a week. And if you've got one of those churches that used all week and you're already lifting the floor for something else, underfloor heating, maybe combined with a heat pump, can be a really good solution. If nothing else is viable, if you've worked your way through the other options and nothing else is viable, we do know that in some circumstances a new gas boiler is going to be needed. A new gas boiler will be better than your old gas boiler, and it will be certainly better than an oil boiler. And if you've got lots of car use, you might want to think about EV charging points, both for your clergy to be able to use, but also for parishioners and potentially for your wider community to be able to use. I've got one second case study. This one's much shorter. I've just put our summary video on rather than the whole longer 5-minute video. And this is of a church that has managed to successfully implement heat pumps. I think it's a really good example of a church at that end of the spectrum and the benefits it's brought them.
This solution to use an air source heat pump sort of suited my philosophy that we all have to play a part in climate change. We all need to be sustainable. We need to conserve materials.
I had a feeling that congregation numbers were falling, and I could quite understand why that would be, because there was no encouragement to come into a building which was cold and damp.
The changes have made access to musical groups much easier, so that you're not constricted by pews being in the way. Not least, it's generally a much warmer place, so it makes for more comfortable rehearsals and performances.
We put in secondary glazing, we put in roof insulation. We also installed LED lighting in the church.
My prayer to God would be to encourage people to listen to each other and to care for each other, and not to be greedy. There is enough for everyone, providing it is used correctly.
So a very different case study, that one. That one's a church that's done a much bigger intervention in their building, and that has worked for them in their circumstance. Right, out of all of that, what are the next steps? So if you are joining today from a church, the kind of steps I would really encourage you to think about are, and firstly, the ones that cost nothing except your very, very precious time. Think about what quick wins would work for you. We've got a really useful guidance note called Heating Your Church This Winter. Have a look through that, see if you can identify any quick wins. Pass a motion at your PCC. I'd really encourage you to pass a motion with two parts, one about becoming an eco church if you're not already, and one about aiming for net zero carbon by 2030. Then use the energy footprint tool to work out your church's carbon footprint. register for EcoChurch and complete the EcoChurch survey. Find our Practical Path to Net Zero Carbon checklist and have a look through that, see what actions come out for your church. And we've got another document called the Route Map to Net Zero Carbon, and we've got, that's a very long document, but we've got a summary version just for churches. All of these are things where links, Denise will be furiously putting links in the chat, and they'll come out with you in the email when we send you the slides after the webinar. Then start thinking through how you're going to replace your heating when the time comes, and thinking through any required temporary heating solution that will give you the time, the grace period that you need to implement that new heating solution. And our heating guidance can really help you there. From all of this information, I know there's quite a few dot points there. From all of this information, you should be able to develop your church's action plan and then take that action plan to your PCC and discuss it. Very useful, relatively low cost steps. You're not going to be surprised to hear me say this again: commissioning an energy audit and switching to 100% renewable electricity. If you're joining from a diocese, really encourage your churches to use the energy footprint tool and work out their carbon footprint. Encourage them to switch to 100% renewables when the energy market allows. Find those guidance measures, so the heating guidance, the energy efficiency measures, and the practical path to net zero, and communicate them. Make sure that your DAC, if it doesn't already, has a sustainability policy. And think about the skills of the advisors that you have on the DAC. Do you have any gaps around heating and around renewables? And over time, work with your colleagues across the diocese to come up with a net zero carbon action plan for your diocese. And passing a diocesan motion, if you haven't already, for net zero carbon by 2030. We have at the moment open to dioceses a diocesan capacity building fund. And hopefully, if you're joining from a diocese, you already know about that. It's designed to help particularly with these dot points above. So creating your action plan for your diocese and taking it to your diocesan synod this year. That's what the starter grants are designed for. And then there are larger grants you can apply for the capacity that you need as a diocese, particularly to be able to, for example, have the advisors that you need. Right, that is me finished. Let me stop sharing my screen. I can see there's quite a few questions come in. Where should we start, Denise?
Right, thank you very much, Catherine. I think the first one we should start on is, are there any funding opportunities that you know of for solar panels? And then an associated question, but will there be any funding from the C of E for changes? Sort of pointing out the small churches often struggle to meet their parish share. So could you answer that, please?
So let me, I'm afraid I'm mostly going to be starting by pointing you to a web page. We have a whole page on our website which has our fundraising, environmental fundraising webinars, and it's got links through to grants directories of the various funders which are out there, which you can approach for environmental projects. So I know that's not one answer saying, you know, apply to this funder, but what I would suggest is find this web page. If you have time, I really recommend watching the webinars on there and then looking through at the grants directories, and you can search for words in there. So you could search for solar or you can search for energy, and it brings up the funders which are most relevant in that space. In terms of funding from the national church, you might be aware that the church commissioners have committed £190 million over the decade to moving the whole church towards net zero carbon, but that needs to cover the schools, the churches, the cathedrals, our housing, our own NCI. It has to cover everything. The funding decisions about how that 190 million will be used are still being taken. The Net Zero Carbon Programme Board, which will make those decisions, has been set up and has had its first 2 meetings. The first funding opportunity that has been opened is the Diocesan Capacity Building Fund I mentioned earlier, because we know that we need to start building our capacity for giving advice and support locally. We need to do that first before anything else can sort of come along. So there will be some funding opportunities, but I would say to everyone to manage your expectations, that whilst £190 million sounds like a lot of money, actually when you consider that we have 32,000 buildings around the country of one kind or another, and that funding has to try and enable action. I wouldn't wait. I would be thinking about how can you fundraise locally for what you want to do locally. And then there may be national funding programs that help in some cases for some sort of demonstrated churches, for example.
Thank you. I also wanted to point out that we've had something in, Charlie has told us that the Historic Churches Trust might, if you speak to your area Historic Churches Trust, they're considering applications in Devon at the moment. And also Fiona's let us know that the Benefact Trust have just released details of a new building improvement fund, and which does list solar panels. So hopefully the people who've asked that question, there's a few opportunities there for you to follow up with. So thank you very much for those.
It is also just worth saying that the majority of the things which I've mentioned today, if you see them as investments in your building, they pay back over time. The exception to that at the moment is generally heat pumps. So heat pumps, because they are an expensive intervention, they really reduce their carbon. You reduce your carbon. They don't generally yet pay back in their lifetime. We are expecting the cost of heat pumps to reduce. But other things like LED lighting, like sorting out your heating control, like solar panels, these are things which reduce your energy use substantially enough that they should pay back over their lifetime. And that's exactly what an energy audit report for your church could help you identify. It'll tell you what interventions, what carbon they would save, what the operational cost is that they would save, and how many years it would take back to pay for doing those works on your building.
Thank you. That leads us neatly on to how do we go about getting an energy audit or seeking church specific advice? Who do we contact? So, I've put the parish buying link into the chat already.
Okay, so for the national energy audits, go onto the parish buying website, click through on the energy audits, and there's a registration of interest form there. Some dioceses have their own energy audit offers, so it's worth going onto your diocesan website and seeing if you can find anything there. If you are looking at a project like a new heating system or solar panels for your church, I would contact your DAC. I know in some places people tend to think that the DAC isn't there to help them. That's really not my experience. And from what I've seen is that the earlier the DAC is involved in a project, that the better that project generally works out, and the more chance that when you get to the point of applying for faculty that you'll get a yes because it's had the right advice early on. So ask your DAC if they have a sustainability advisor or a heating advisor who could come and talk to you. Some dioceses do, some dioceses don't, and some dioceses they're very stretched, but just ask your diocese what they have available.
And I think
if you want to commission, if you want to commission like a consultant to come in and advise you in more depth, then a good place to start is on the CIBSE website, the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers.
Thank you. And your point about engaging early with the DAC is also relevant to the planning authority if you're likely to need planning permission as well. So there's a question about whether you need faculty to install under pew heaters.
Unless you have historic, let me get this absolutely right. Unless you have historic pews, then they are now, I should know this off by heart, I believe they are now a list B item, which means your archdeacon, not your diocese. I should know that off by heart, and I'm feeling foolish for not doing so. Give me a second, I will find the answer.
Okay, well, just whilst you're looking for that, Martin has very helpfully added into the chat some details about temperature loggers, which was one of the questions in the chat. So he's used temperature loggers from Elitech. Obviously, we can't recommend any particular products here today, but Martin has obviously used them, so that's a useful thing for you to know. And just while you're still looking for that, Catherine, let me know when you've done it. Charlie's let us know that they've also gone plastic free in their quest to be carbon neutral. Now, obviously, for the route map itself, the synod has committed to being net zero carbon for a certain scope of emissions, and that's the emissions from our buildings, from the fuels that we use in our buildings and the fuels that we use in our vehicles. So plastic isn't within the scope of our net zero target, but it is a great thing to do, and it also helps with engagement, looking at those wider environmental topics. So the things that people get a bit more excited about perhaps than under pew heaters.
So I've looked up the lists. Thank you so much for answering those questions, Denise. When the faculty rules were updated last July, this section was added. So the installation, this is in list B, which means it's not a full faculty application, it's seeking permission from your archdeacon. The installation of an electric heating system for attachment to pews made in or after 1850 and which are not of historic interest. These conditions here. So the details, the location, the fixings and the cable runs need to be submitted to the archdeacon. It needs to be done by somebody who's accredited, and no article of historic or artistic interest is removed or disposed of. So with those caveats, if your pews are not historic, then it is now a list B matter.
Thank you, Catherine, for sorting that out. I think this is a really important question from Wendy, which is that they had a new gas boiler installed in 2014, and there's resistance to changing it because it's thought that not using it until it's too old is also a factor in creating carbon emissions. What do you think about this? I think this is a really important question, which will probably apply to quite a few people.
I agree. So one thing I didn't, these sessions are only an hour. I can't cover. There are some slides I've had in and then taken out, and one of them is about the difference between operational carbon and embodied carbon. So the operational carbon is the carbon emissions as you're running your building once it's up and running. So burning the fossil fuels in your gas boiler. The embodied carbon is all of the materials that it's taken to build that building, make those systems, build that boiler, install that boiler, and then at the end of its life, take it out and deal with that. All of that embodied carbon, you've already invested that in that gas boiler. If you rip out a functioning heating system and put in a new heating system, you're creating all of that embodied carbon. Now, at the moment, the embodied carbon isn't in the scope of our net zero by 2030 target, but the operational carbon is. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be mindful of it. If you've got a perfectly functioning heating system, then I would say at the moment, try and optimize that heating system, try and use it as efficiently as possible. Think really carefully about, say you've got a gas boiler and on a Sunday you need the whole space heating. Could you use the gas boiler on a Sunday, but could you buy some heated chair cushions and use those for choir practice on a Tuesday evening and the PCC meeting on the Thursday? So think about, can you use your existing gas or oil boiler less of the week and use it when it's really needed and supplement it with electric solutions? Obviously, there's a cutoff as your boiler gets older and older and older. And that's where you really need local specific advice from someone who knows your church, knows your system, knows your usage, knows your boiler. If it's really, really old and it's getting on its last legs, then you know you need to be looking at a replacement. If it's really brand spanking new, I would say make it last, make it be efficient. Somewhere in the middle, there's a tipping point, and you would need somebody to help you think through where that is for your church.
Thank you very much for that. We've only got 1 minute left. So I think, my goodness, someone's asking about conversion factors. When you get the slides, you'll be able to see Catherine's explanation on there. We have underfloor heating, but it's run on gas. Is it easy to change it to electric? I think that might be a technical question for someone.
I don't think it is, but you'd need someone who knows your system. On the conversion factors, just to say, churches don't need to worry what the conversion factors are. I mean, they're available on the government website. If you search greenhouse gas conversion factors, they'll come up. But you don't need to worry about what they are, because they're already built into the energy footprint tool. That's how the energy footprint tool works. So when you type your utility bills into the energy footprint tool, it behind the scenes uses those conversion factors to work out what your carbon footprint is. That's what's inside the box, and we update them every year so that they're the latest ones.
Lovely. Thank you so much. It is now 1 o'clock. So I think it just leaves me to say, because we do like to finish on time, we know that it's your lunch break as well. Catherine, thank you so very much for such a full and informative webinar. I hope that everybody has taken something away from it, that we can all start somewhere. There's lots of quick wins, just turning things off that aren't needed. And every little thing that you do like that will help you save money as well as saving carbon, which in these straitened times is also so very important. So I think what you presented to us today is absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much. Right, I'm just going to save the chat so that we can send those out to you. All of the links in the chat will be sent out to you with the slides, and a recording of this session will be available in about a week. So thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks for coming.